Hello everyone, welcome to our study of early Christian, Jewish, and Byzantine art. Now with this part of the class we're going to move away from the realism of the ancient Greeks and Romans and move into a more stylized kind of art as the focus went more towards, we should say, spiritual means and away from achieving an idealized life here on earth. Let's begin our study with a conversation about what is meant by the Middle Ages. This term was coined in the Renaissance, and it covers a period of about 1,000 years between the collapse of the Roman Empire, which happened in the 5th century, and the beginning of the Renaissance in 1400. While the term originally meant a time of ignorance and barbarism between the two great ages of Greece and the innovations of the Renaissance, that's no longer really held to be true. In fact, the Middle Ages was a time of rich innovation that laid the groundwork for the Renaissance. In the year 323 AD, the Emperor Constantine moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to Constantinople, which is what we know as Istanbul today in Turkey. This move split both the Roman Empire and the Christian Church into two defined groups. The Western Church became the Roman Catholic Church, and the Eastern Church became the Eastern Orthodox, also referred to as Byzantine. In the Roman Catholic tradition, the Church was independent of the state. Although the leaders still held a lot of control, maybe sometimes an uneasy control as they worked with the political and aristocracy, the political powers and the aristocracy. But in the Eastern Orthodox Church, the secular and the spiritual were combined. The emperor appointed the patriarch, or the highest leader of the church, and this led to a very powerful Eastern Orthodox Church that held on to power for centuries, and a fractionated Catholic Church in the West, as the church and the state struggled to maintain a balance of power. Now, three religions arose in the Near East during this time that still dominate the spiritual life of the Western world today. We have Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All three of these religions are monotheistic, meaning that they believe that the same God of Abraham created and rules the universe. Now, as we remember, the term monotheistic means basically one God. Mono is one, and theistic is God. So, of these three religions, they each have a different teaching, but it's very interesting to see the similarities. Now, let's look at what we're talking about. During the period that we're going to be discussing, that saw the early spread of Christianity and ultimately the legalization of Christianity by Constantine, the Roman Empire still extended completely around the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, but it was beginning to be destabilized. Let's talk for a moment about early Christianity. In the early days of the Christian Church, before Constantine ended the persecution of the Christians, people met in private homes, as well as in the catacombs or the burial chambers under underpopulated areas. Around the year 40 AD, the term Christian was first used, and around 70 to 80 AD was when Christianity broke with Judaism and the New Testament was written. Now, this is very interesting because it's several years after the death of Christ. By the early 2nd century, the hierarchical and internal structure of the church and of the liturgy was being developed. And the liturgy means how people worship. What does that look like? Now, to the left here is the model of an early Christian baptismal font that would have been in a private home. Below that is a home synagogue from the Jewish faith, and to the right is a view of the catacombs where the early Christians would have worshipped. Early Christian art is fascinating. Of course, to me, all art is fascinating, but the earliest Christians were mostly poor people and women who were later joined by upper-class converts. And because they had to meet in secret, very little of their art has survived. To the left is a statue that reflects Greek influence, and this one to the left is an important piece because it's kind of the remnants of the realism that we see with the Greeks. And that realism is going to basically go to sleep for about 1,000 years. So this image shows the shepherd caring for his flock, which is a really popular image in Christianity, both then and now. Below are two images of Jonah and the whale. I just love these because they're so darn weird. I don't know how well you can see this in the slide, but this is a depiction of a whale. It's sort of like I'd call it a rhinoceros pig whale because that's what it looks like. This person had just not seen a whale, but they want to depict Jonah being eaten by the whale and coming back out. So you can see there's Jonah going in, his little legs and feet. Help me! He's going into the mouth of the whale. And then on the other one, he's being spit back out of that whale. But the whale now has little ears and has kind of a snaky end on it. But anyway, it's just art, and I find it fascinating. Now, around the year 325 AD, Constantine convened the First Nicene Council. And it was at this time which a Latin form of the Bible was completed. And it was called the Vulgate, which means for the common people. As Christianity grew, it was necessary to build a lot of churches in a hurry. And we're going to look at that. But I want to say one more thing about the Nicene councils. Now, many people that are involved in the Christian faith may not have even heard of these councils. They're so interesting because what happened was in 325, the Bible was brought together. And it was at that time when they decided what books got in and what books did not. There was another Nicene Council that convened, I think it's about 725, 752, somewhere in there. And that was when they really codified and clarified the Catholic liturgy, and they created the priesthood and all the rules around that about celibacy. So what I find fascinating, and I invite your further exploration, is to understand how long this was after the death of Christ. And that can sometimes shed some light and be interesting to people that are of the Christian faith. But we were talking about how they had to build a bunch of churches in a hurry. So let's go back to that. Uh-oh, I have a bum slide here. Well, I could fix it or I could not. Watch this. All right, it's all better. After the Edict of Milan in 313, when Constantine ended the persecution of the Christian, there was a big need to build churches in a hurry because suddenly the Christians were coming out of the back room and they could celebrate publicly. So two main styles of churches developed out of this time. The first one is called the Basilica plan and is pictured above left, right here. The second one is called the round design or central plan, and it's lower left and right below. So let's look at the Basilica plan, lower left picture. This is the newer St. Peter's built outside of Rome. There's an old St. Peter's that we'll look at in the next slide. Now, this is built on the spot where St. Peter was supposed to have been crucified. And this is the design that was most widely adapted by the Western Church. So the central plan, I think it's a beautiful design because if you look at the lower right picture, you see the altar is in the middle and all around is a walkway where people can walk and ambulate around the central feature. So it's round. There's no front, there's no back, it's a circle. And that has a beautiful effect, I imagine, on the worshipers. So now let's look at the old St. Peter's. The old St. Peter's is depicted above in a drawing, and it was built right after Constantine legalized the practice of Christianity. Now this church was torn down, and there was another one built in the 16th century, so we don't really have, what we have of it is from these drawings. But what's interesting to note about this drawing is that it is a plan that was used in Christian churches pretty much since that time. So here we have Santa Sabina, which was built in Rome also. And this church looks much as it did look at the time it was built, which was about 422 AD. Now, when we look at it from the outside, we think, ho-hum, not a big deal, just some old brick building. But when you look at the interior, it's really beautiful. We'll see as we go forward that the architecture is going to change, so there'll be more light in the churches of the Gothic era. But this one, even if it has minimized windows, is so beautiful. I want you to notice the columns, okay? These are columns that were taken from Roman ruins. They're called spolia, or spoils. They're the spoils of war, where someone comes in and kind of borrows, shall we say, something and then puts it in a church, which is kind of fun to think about. But we're moving on. That is Santa Sabina, which is a very early example of a Christian church in Rome. Santa Costanza was built for the daughter of Constantine, who died and then was made a saint later. She was called Constantina, so his daughter, Constantine's daughter, Constantina, had this mausoleum built at the time of her death. It's a beautiful example of a central planned church. Now, originally, this church was full of marble and mosaics, much of which is lost. But what remains is really interesting in how it ties into biblical and pagan references, because there are vines that are full of cherubs, and these cherubs are actually picking and stomping grapes into wine. So there you go, everything is connected. Now next up, I'd like to talk a little bit about icons. Above we have a mosaic of Christ from Hagia Sophia, and we'll look at that in a moment. But we're going to use this picture to begin our look at icons and how they affected the church. The term icon means, officially, an image representing a sacred figure or event. Many early Christians believed that a consecrated work of art was a kind of vehicle to communicate with the spiritual world. Prayer rituals often involved worship of images, and pilgrims would venture on long journeys to visit sacred shrines. Now, many church leaders were a little bit uncomfortable about this because they saw worshiping these objects as being akin to worshiping idols. So beginning in 726, the Emperor Leo III undertook a campaign called iconoclasm, or image breaking. And during this period, all religious images that he deemed as inappropriate were destroyed. Of course, they were not all destroyed because we're still looking at them. But those people who defended the images were persecuted and probably called, heathens or, the worshipers of the devil or whatever. But those, over the next 120 years, these iconoclasts ruled the church sporadically. So it was kind of like, yes, we love art. No, art is bad. Back and forth for about 120 years. And a lot of really beautiful art was destroyed, but you know what? Some remained. For example, this beautiful picture of Christ with gold inlay. Now, the iconoclasts weakened church power as the wealth of art drew patrons and converts, right? So people would come, they would travel great distances to worship a particular work of art, and they would leave alms, and that's how the churches made a lot of their money. It also increased the tension between the East and the West, as the West defended the practice. Eventually, an important distinction was made between veneration and respect, and images were used as a teaching tool for the largely illiterate worshipers. Now that's an important thing to remember, is that most of the people that were worshiping, they were not literate. They could not read the Bible. So many of these mosaics were used as teaching tools and had great value in that way. Now you could see that that would increase their importance to the people who were viewing them. So we're going to wrap up slideshow number one, with our discussion of icons and iconoclasts. And one more thing on the icons. I do find it interesting to note what we use as symbols in our own life, to see what represents and has power to us, what symbols evoke reverence within us. It's sometimes a fascinating thing to study. Well, thanks for listening, and Stay tuned for part 2.